Hello, and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. For generations, there's been praise for any country with a high GDP. That is the measure of growth that is said to show how rich a nation is. But that may be changing. Watch out for happiness. This is Roundtable. Countries like Iceland and New Zealand are now looking at well-being rather than just gross domestic product and basing their future plans on how fortunate people feel. Get ready for others to do the same.
Our fixation on economic growth, particularly since World War II, has lifted millions out of poverty, drastically improving people's quality of life. Yet it is this obsession with producing and consuming more and more that has also led to the planet's rapid demise. And as the coronavirus pandemic continues to claim tens of thousands of lives, cripple economies and halt normal life, there are calls for governments to prioritise health over wealth. So one idea is to move away from economic growth as the main indicator of success. Until now, it's been measured in GDP, or gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced by a country. For the first time in 30 years, China has dropped its GDP growth target. The world's second biggest economy shrank by 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020. Critics argue that GDP is an outdated model, focusing only on growth at the expense of other important indicators. And countries like Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and New Zealand are listening, focusing instead on well-being. This means looking at a range of measures like economic inequality, unemployment, the environment, and even mental health as well as GDP. But as global lockdowns begin to ease, the road ahead will be difficult. So could the pandemic force governments to move beyond economic growth as a measure of progress?
Very pleased to say that joining us from Devon in the UK, we have Stewart Wallis, Executive Chair of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Also, Vicky Pryce, we welcome back to the programme, Chief Economic Advisor to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and Gylfi Magnusson, former Government Minister and now Economist and Associate Professor at the University of Iceland. Great to have you all on the programme. Stewart, can I start with you first of all? The King of Bhutan, I think, believes he coined the phrase gross national happiness and set up an index in his country back in the early 1970s. Looking at your site, you have Scotland, Wales, Iceland and New Zealand as government participants. Is it changing very slowly?
No, it's actually changing quite rapidly. We only set up the Wellbeing Economy Alliance less than 2 years ago, and we instigated the government partnership, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. But already, within a year of that being set up, New Zealand had instituted a Wellbeing Economy budget. Both Scotland and Iceland have got Wellbeing Economy frameworks. And the concept of a well-being economy is all over the media now. So it's really moved really fast. And you'll see, just as Wales has just joined the partnership, but you'll see several other countries joining almost certainly within the next year, including some quite big ones.
Okay, Bhutan put 9 domains it divided into psychological well-being, health, education, time use, cultural diversity, and so on, good governance, etc. How would you describe a well-being economy?
I would describe, very simply, it's one that starts with its goal of human and ecological well-being. So the sort of 5 key things you'd have are focusing on human needs before human wants. That's fundamental needs from health, education, even economic security. Regenerating the natural world, it's not sufficient to sustain it. Much fairer than most economies, and institutions repurposed to focus on the common good. And then the 5th one is people feeling valued, feeling that their voices are heard and that they've got some control over their lives. And it's the whole point of a wellbeing economy is you focus on what people really want. and then look at how you get there, rather than having your goal as GDP and then trying to clear up some of the messes you've made on the way.
Gylfi, in Iceland, you were in government 10 years ago. You say they were talking about it at the time, and I think Iceland's preparing the idea, at least, of a well-being budget with 39 indicators. Is that right?
Yes. This is, of course, something that has been a long time in development, but politicians and economists, I think most agree that the measure that we've been using until now, GDP, is a deeply flawed one. It doesn't really tell you how well an economy is doing, except in very broad details. And it's an even worse measure of whether the society is good in some sense. So we are working on trying to come up with more meaningful measures, taking a much broader look at the economy. And hopefully that means we will also have more efficient government policies to deal with not just the current crisis, but managing society in general.
If the money is mainly being spent on making people feel valued, that their lives are good lives that they're leading, which is a great thing, is there a danger in taking your eye off making money for your country so you can afford all these things?
No, actually, I think the two go together, because if you have people that are content and can find new opportunities, you have an educational system that allows everybody to flourish, then that's good for the economy. So there's not really a trade-off. If you have a good welfare system, an educational and health system that serves everybody so nobody falls through the net, then that's just good for the economy. I mean, it costs a bit, but you get that money back. It's a good investment.
Vicky, Robert Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning, I think, economist, talked about the GDP fixation. Is that time over?
No, because you can measure GDP reasonably easily. It's not always it's very straightforward because you do it on the basis of lots of surveys. You find out about incomes, you find out about output, you find out about expenditure. Of course, right now we're in the middle of a crisis and those surveys don't tell you an awful lot. Whereas if you're looking at it on normal times, of course, you can get some fair idea of what is happening in the economy. And after all, even though the surveys may not be fantastically accurate right now, you still get the notion that you're slowing down, you're falling into recession, and therefore you need to do something about it. Of course, well-being or wellness indices are a good idea to have in any case, because you can measure whether what you're doing has an impact on the population as a whole. But a lot of it is circular, as you've just been hearing. Of course, the economy and happiness, you want to call it that, well-being, go hand in hand together. So, for example, quite a lot of the emphasis in the UK on well-being has been on mental health. What happens, how do you feel, and therefore other serious issues with the way in which you view the world, and should we do something about it? But in reality, one of the biggest impacts on mental health and mental illness is being unemployed.
I'm wondering if I may interrupt. I'm wondering if, in fact, there's going to be a danger here of increasing inequalities if you focus on growth, how rich the country is, rather than on how people feel.
That's entirely possible, and that's why I think you need to have this indices in parallel. And there is a serious concern that as we're coming out of this crisis right now, all the people who've been able to carry on working have been the ones who earn more and can work from home, whereas all those at the lower wage brackets are the ones who are most affected by this. So indeed, we may come out of it as a very unequal society. Now, of course, that's not good for growth in the long term anyway. It's not good for sustainability. So it makes a lot of sense to see how you can turn things around. So of course, you can make them more involved, the people who lose their jobs. You can give them more power to perhaps be involved in society and so on. If you don't create the jobs for them, you're just not going to get that equality improving. There are now great suggestions that we should move towards a universal basic income, so that you just distribute money to people and make them happier that way. Now, of course, that does very little to the productive economy. I'm completely in favor of universal basic income anyway, particularly to cover lots of sectors which are very undervalued right now. But you do need to focus very much on how you can get, as you were asking earlier, the money to ensure that you can do this redistribution. If you have inequality, it's the problem of the authorities that haven't bothered very much in redistributing wealth or incomes. That is the issue.
Stewart and Gylfi, I'm going to ask you to respond in just a moment to what Vicky has said, and then I'm going to read out a quote from Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister. But what do you think about the arguments, Stewart, first of all, that Vicky's putting forward?
Well, I totally agree with Vicky that jobs and livelihoods matter. I think they're very fundamental to most people's well-being. And so very much the types of well-being economies we're working with aren't just measuring people's subjective well-being. That's important, but they're also measuring issues like unemployment, how many people have got good jobs, what's happening to the environment, what's happening to health and education. And the key point, I think, about growth is where we've got to dethrone growth is as the principal driver of the economy. Yes, it's a useful measure, but it's an accelerator. I mean, it basically tells you whether you're going faster or slower. It doesn't tell you whether you're overheating. It doesn't tell you whether you're about to run out of fuel. And it doesn't tell you, if you think about it for a moment, going faster in the wrong direction is not very clever. So you've got to have those other things. And we would never dream of just flying a plane or driving a car, just worrying about the throttle. We have to look at other things. So our key view is that you've got to focus directly on jobs. You've got to focus directly on, and you've got to, in this crisis, the logical thing to do is to focus particularly on green jobs and caring jobs. We've shown how valuable they are. They're actually low carbon jobs as well. So growth is a means. And the key thing is it's growth of what for who, and what matters is what your goals are. And that's a critical thing. You still got to measure growth, GDP and growth, but you shouldn't have it as your key goal.
Gylfi, this is what Jacinda Ardern had to say. Nobody wants to live in a country where, despite a strong economy, families are homeless, where our environment is being rapidly degraded and people with mental health issues do not receive the support they need. She talked about homelessness just there, high youth suicide, etc., to which an opposition leader, Simon Bridges, responded, rightly or wrongly, it will be the botched budget. Middle New Zealand is worse off. My question to you, because I asked you about the practicalities at the beginning of this, was why did Iceland decide this was the right thing to do?
Well, maybe it has to do with the fact that we're a rather small island with a small population, so everybody counts, and you can't really afford to lose people that go off the tracks, people that become unemployed and disenfranchised, and young people that drop out of school. That's not just a problem for them, it's a problem for society. So having a welfare net that takes care of people while they're unemployed, and of course economic policies that stimulate job creation, and then policies that help the young especially stay in school and get an education and then join the workforce with valuable skills. That's both good social policy and good economic policy. And
in terms of the cost, because you talk about the downside if people are unemployed or if their mental health is unstable. In terms of the cost, has anybody worked out how much financially this is going to sting the Icelandic economy, or does it even out?
Well, in the short run, of course, it costs. The fiscal deficit of the public sector, both local and national government, will be quite substantial. But that's basically an investment. And the returns on that investment, if the programs work, will be quite substantial. So, of course, we don't really know how the pandemic is going to play out, how long, etc. So figures are very hard to nail down, but it could be something like a deficit of 10% of GDP.
You see, this is part of the problem that, as I see it, is it's all very well came up with these great ideas, and you say you have public backing, but as soon as people are hit in their own pockets, they may well vote to go the other way and say, actually, we don't want this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a danger. You could have people pushing for austerity or other government measures that maybe save them a little bit on the tax bill. But
okay, well let's go to Stewart because he wanted to jump in at that point.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I think the one we're actually working at the minute, and this was pre-pandemic, on the fiscal benefits of a well-being economy, trying to demonstrate what money you save by doing things right, rather than having to fix up the pollution or the inequality or the other problems that by focusing just on growth you get. But the critical thing, I think, is we've got to realize that before the pandemic even, the latest Edelman barometer, which is trust barometer they do every year, that's about 34,000 people in 28 countries, showed that less than 1 in 5 people think their economic system's working for them. So there's already major discontent. And I think if you're able to focus on good job creation coming out of this and to put the investment, as Gylfi is saying, into the right things, I think a lot of people will support that. And I don't think there's an appetite to go back to austerity. I think at the moment where borrowing is so cheap, and using the ways and means system that the UK government's currently borrowing on, I think they can afford to put some serious investments into shifting the economy. This is a major opportunity to build the economy better, and that's what people want.
Vicky, let me come to you as an economist, and I know you others are also part of the same stable, if you like. But the Easterlin paradox, 1974, a guy called Richard Easterlin. He finished off his essay this way: economic growth does not raise a society to some ultimate state of plenty. Rather, the growth process itself engenders ever-growing wants that lead it ever onward. His suggestion being that once you've started looking at growth and regarding that as the holy grail, you cannot stop.
I think there's some truth in it. The really interesting thing for me is what type of growth are we likely to be having in the future, or should we be having in the future? I think there's already a change in perceptions. People are much more concerned about the environment, more concerned about global warming and worried about this. Of course, they're also looking at the way in which we work. We've learned quite a lot during this crisis in terms of greater flexibility and what perhaps that could do to productivity. So far, it has improved that it's increasing it, so we have to just watch it a little bit. But in reality, what we need in every case is a society that values various things in a way that then leads to the type of growth that is going to be good and sustainable. And if we have this inequality, if indeed growth just leads to greater riches for the people at the top and leaves lots of people at the bottom disenfranchised, if you like, which of course will immediately ring alarm bells for those who are putting well-being indices together, then you don't have growth in a sustainable way that achieves the objectives that it should be doing. So there's nothing wrong with growth per se. It's really what you do with it, how you.
But have we become fixated with it?
Possibly, but frankly, I mean, just look at the austerity issue that was just raised. In reality, the moment a country grows less or less fast than the interest rate it has to pay for its debt, then it's basically in default, just never ever going to be able to sustain that. So growth matters from that point of view. But at the same time, you can look at the various resources that you have, the inputs into your growth, and look at them differently. Actually, I agree entirely with some of the things that were said in the sense that education is a public good. Proper infrastructure is a public good. Those are the areas that we need to be investing anyway in order to achieve the growth that we want. So there isn't any real disagreement between the two sides. It's just that we absolutely still need the growth to be able to do the rest.
Before we had austerity, Stewart, this one for you and also for you, Gylfi, we had in this country at least Gordon Brown saying prudence, 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 prudence. We have to be careful with money. How can you make sure with a well-being economy, when there are so many things that people will want to invest in, how do you make sure the money is properly spent?
Oh, very good question. I think given what we face with climate change, there is still, the evidence is out whether we can actually decouple even if we move to green growth fast enough from the carbon involved in what's happening. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence emerging that we actually could move our economy off having to grow. Now, that requires shifting focus, say, from labor productivity to resource productivity. It means shifting your taxes mostly onto resources and waste and wealth and things like that, and transactions. It requires retooling your economy. And that's what actually I think we need now. We actually need a different economic system, much the same way in the 20th century we had Keynesianism and then we had neoliberalism. We've had two shifts already. And I see a well-being economy being potentially a real shift, not just tweaks at the margin.
Which leads me to want to ask Gylfi, in terms of the neoliberalism, in terms of the Keynesian policies, etc., are we now arriving at a new economic model that you think could well be not only adopted across a number of different international economies, but also be successful?
Well, I'm not so optimistic as to think that we are arriving at it, but we definitely see the need for it. Much of what we have relied on as basic truth about how the economy works, the neoclassical economic system, has shown itself to be embarrassingly deficient, not just during the pandemic, but also during the financial crisis 10 years ago. And that, of course, calls for new thinking. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet, but we definitely have to address these issues. The well-being approach is one, but we definitely have to address.
Vicky, I'll come to you in just a moment to wrap up the programme, but Stuart, a quick thought for you. I noted when you spoke to our producers that you suggested that the economies and organisations that were taking these measures up and quite seriously had particularly one common denominator, and that was female leaders.
Well, in fact, one of the groups I'm working with is just working on an academic paper now to test out the research. And certainly the initial evidence says that actually in those countries that had female leaders, the actual aggregate number of deaths is about 6 times lower than countries that had male leaders, taking a sample of about 15 or 20. But obviously per capita, that's not difference is as great as that, but there's still a real difference. And certainly there's evidence that female leaders generally acted quickly, faster, whether it's New Zealand or Taiwan. Now, it's not true in obviously it's not true in every case.
I'm sure it isn't, but it's a very interesting fact. And Vicky, we come to you to help wrap up the programme. While we have a male leader in the UK, will we ever see a well-being budget here?
There's quite a push to bring the well-being agenda up again, and of course, the gender equality issue is a seriously important one at present. As you know, I've written quite a lot about it, including a book recently called Women versus Capitalism, where I looked at the decisions that would have been made, particularly on the financial front, if we had had women leaders for central banks and in monetary policy committees and so on. My worry is that we may be going backwards in this sense, particularly on gender equality. It's women who've been mostly affected by the crisis. It's them who've been at the front line suffering health issues and also losing jobs, and it's them who are going to be eliminated by technology and artificial intelligence and so on. So there is a serious worry that we may be going backwards. And do I really think that in the current regime all these things will be pushed forward? Well, we even stopped asking for this year anyway, postponed it, for big firms to publish their pay reviews, which show the pay gap between men and women. So no, I'm quite pessimistic about this. But the fact that we have, at least now, in quite a lot of countries with women leaders, also in Europe, is a huge encouragement to me. And the more of that, the better.
Okay, so in the UK, where we have a government saying whatever it takes, throwing money at everything for obvious reasons at the moment, and talking about how there will be changes, is that going to happen, or is that slightly hypocritical?
The question is how much they can carry on borrowing for how long really they can carry on borrowing at the rates that they have. They're not going to have to borrow quite as much in future years, assuming there is any growth, and that's why growth is important again. If we get the growth, then obviously there isn't going to be the need to support so many people who are now subsidised to sort of not go to work. So with the easing of the lockdown, things might improve in that respect. If they can carry on borrowing without anyone really worrying, and the capital markets seem to be very happy to do so, yields are very, very low, sometimes negative, which is quite extraordinary, not just in the UK, but also in other countries too. Then some of the agenda can be met. But what everyone is worried about is that all this levelling up that they talked about originally, all this regional inequality fixing that they hoped they would do, is actually going to be considerably more expensive given the inequalities we already have and the fact that many regions have been worse hit than, say, London. By
Vicky, I have to stop you there. Stewart Wallis, thank you very much indeed. Gylfi Magnusson, Vicky Pryce, appreciate your time very much on this programme. But if you borrow and it makes people happy, well, there you go. Thank you for taking part in the programme. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable from me, David Foster, and the team that put it together. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.